The thermometer on the wall read -38. Marcus stared at it for a moment longer than he needed to, not because he didn't believe it, because part of him had hoped he'd misread it the first time. He turned back to the door. The handle had seized sometime in the last 2 hours. He could feel it through the gray wool of his gloves. The metal wasn't just cold. It had fused with something, ice working into the frame like grout between tile. He tried twice already. The door hadn't moved at all. Not a creak. Not a millimeter of give. Just his breath fogging against the wood and the sound of wind pressing in from outside like a wall leaning against the cabin. Nora was sitting near the back corner, her knees drawn up, the red wool scarf pulled across the lower half of her face. She was watching him. He didn't say anything yet. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet of old Forest Service shelter that hadn't been stocked for a winter stay. There was a wood stove but no wood, a cot with a foam mattress and no blankets, a shelf with 2 water bottles, a pack of crackers, a box of matches, and a single emergency candle in a metal holder, about 4 inches tall. Marcus had found the candle 20 minutes ago. He'd lit it immediately, not for warmth. One candle doesn't warm a room, but because the dark had started doing something to the edges of thought he didn't like. The candle was sitting on the floor between them now. That was the thing he kept coming back to. Not the door, not the temperature outside, not even Nora's breathing, which had gone shallow in the last half hour. The candle. The way the flame barely moved despite the drafts he could feel along the floor. Like it was concentrating. Like it was the only thing in the room that understood what was happening and had decided to hold very still. How bad? Nora said. Handle seized. Ice in the frame, probably. She nodded once. Didn't push it further. That was something Marcus had always noticed about her. She didn't manufacture urgency. Even now, with the temperature reading what it read and the door doing what it was doing, she absorbed information and let it settle before she spoke again. It was the thing that had kept them from spiraling in the first hour, when the storm had closed faster than the forecast said it would and they'd had maybe 8 minutes to get off the trail and find this place. Can you break the seal? She asked. Not from inside. Frame's integrated. It's not like I can chip it. She pulled the scarf down slightly, just enough to speak clearly. What about the window? He'd already looked. Single pane, older frame, painted shut from the outside. Even if he broke the glass, the opening was maybe 14 inches wide. Last resort, he said. The wind outside wasn't constant. That was the part that got into your head. It came in surges, long, low pressure that built over maybe 20 seconds and then slammed against the structure like something that had been running toward it from a distance. The cabin held each time, but the walls flexed. Marcus could feel it through the floor. He moved back from the door and sat down across from Nora, maybe 3 feet from the candle. The foam mattress was the only insulating material in the room. He'd already pulled it off the cot and folded it once, setting it against the base of the door to stop the draft that was moving along the floor. It helped. Not enough. Nora's hands were inside her coat now. You should eat something, Marcus said. I'm not hungry. Doesn't matter. She looked at him, then reached for the crackers. He watched her hands when they came back out. The fingertips were pale, not white, not yet, but the kind of pale that meant blood had already started retreating from the surface. Her body pulling circulation inward, protecting the core. She was cold, colder than she was letting on. There's a threshold in hypothermia that most people don't know about because they've never been near it. The body doesn't announce it. You don't feel it arrive. Your core temperature drops from 98.6 and somewhere around 95 the shivering intensifies. That's the body doing its job, generating heat through muscle movement. But below 95 something shifts. The shivering starts to ease. Not because you're warming up, because the body has run the math and begun to conserve. Marcus knew this. He was watching for it. Nora hadn't stopped shivering. That was still the right sign. But the shivering had changed character in the last 20 minutes. It was less rhythmic, more irregular. Her body was working hard and the room was winning. He pulled off his outer jacket. Don't, she said immediately. I'm not cold. Marcus, I'm running warmer than you. He handed it across the candle. I've been moving. You haven't. She took it after a moment, which told him she needed it more than she wanted to admit. He was colder without the jacket. He felt it immediately along his shoulders and down his arms. The cabin air was sitting somewhere around 20 degrees, which was brutally cold for indoors, but manageable as long as he kept moving. He stood up and started walking the perimeter of the small room in slow, deliberate loops, 6 steps each way. He'd done 30 circuits before Nora spoke again. "The door," she said. "The ice in the frame, it's on the outside? Has to be. The frame's old wood. When the temperature dropped this fast, moisture in the grain froze. The gap between door and frame sealed over. Wood contracts in cold." He stopped walking, looked at her. She was right. At sustained extreme cold, wood contracts. Meaning the frame should have been pulling slightly away from the door, not pressing tighter. Which meant the problem wasn't the frame contracting around the door. It was water. Something had gotten into the gap, rain, maybe before the temperature dropped, or condensation from earlier, and frozen solid. A thin vertical column of ice acting as a pin. Not the frame. Not the handle. Ice in a specific place. He went back to the door. He pulled the foam mattress away from the base and pressed his gloved hand flat against the lower edge of the door, then slowly worked upward. At about hip height on the left side, the door had a slight inward bow, barely visible. He could feel through the wool where the gap was tightest. The seam between door and frame had essentially no space there. That was it. That was where the water had pooled and locked. One point, maybe a 12-inch section. He needed heat there, applied directly, for long enough to melt the ice column without warming the surrounding air so much that it refroze somewhere else. He looked at the candle. The candle was 4 inches tall. At the rate it was burning, maybe 3 hours of light left. If he used it on the door, he'd shorten that. In a room this cold, losing the candle's light was a different kind of problem, not thermal but psychological. Darkness at -20 indoors did something to decision-making that he didn't want to test. He stood there a moment, holding that calculation. "What are you thinking?" Nora asked. "Trying to figure out how much it costs to try this." He used the candle. He picked it up carefully and held the flame close to the left side of the door at hip height, moving it slowly up and down along the seam. The wax was still there, just barely. His hand was steadier than he expected. The flame trembled with each gust through the wall seams but didn't go out. 3 minutes. 5. He pulled on the handle. Nothing. He kept going. The candle was down to maybe 2.5 inches now, the flame pooling at the edge of the wick. Nora had stood up without him noticing. She was behind him, close, and he could feel the warmth of her breath near his shoulder. She wasn't saying anything, just present. 8 minutes. He pulled again. The door moved. A 1/4 inch, then resistance again, then a sound like tape being peeled from glass, and the whole left edge came free. Cold air punched through the gap like a fist. He didn't open it all the way. Not yet. The outside temperature was -38 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind was still running. Opening the door meant the cabin temperature would drop immediately and sharply. He held it cracked, let the pressure equalize, then pushed it back almost shut, leaving just enough of a break that it wouldn't seal again. He turned around. Nora had both hands pressed to her mouth. "Okay," she said. That was all. He put the candle back on the floor. It was down to maybe 2 inches. The flame was smaller now, working with less wax, but it was still there. He watched it for a moment. It had been sitting between them for hours, burning at its own pace while everything else in the room had been deteriorating. There was something in that he didn't have language for. He wasn't a sentimental person, but he looked at the candle the way you look at something that has been quietly on your side. The door being cracked changed the math in the room. Not warmly. The air was colder now, a thin stream of -38 working in through the gap, but the sealed feeling was gone. The ceiling of the situation had lifted a few inches. They could get out if they had to. They weren't locked in. That distinction mattered more than the temperature. Nora sat back down. She still had his jacket over her own coat, and she'd pulled both collars up around her jaw. Her shivering had regularized again. He could see it in her shoulders, a steady rhythm. Good. Still working. "How long until first light?" she asked. He checked his watch. Just past 2 a.m. Sunrise at this latitude in February was around 7:15. 5 hours. She absorbed this, didn't comment on it. They'd been in the cabin for nearly 4 hours already. The cold had been consistent but survivable. The real danger going forward was cumulative fatigue and the slow depletion of core temperature over time. They were both still above threshold. But 5 more hours of this was a different kind of math. "We need to sleep in shifts," Marcus said. "One person moving, one person resting. I can take first rest." "I know. But you're not going to sleep." She looked at him. "Neither are you." He knew she was right. What he didn't say was that he was more concerned about her than himself. Not because he was being protective in any deliberate way, but because he'd been watching her body's signals all night the way you watch a gauge. The paleness in her fingertips, the irregularity of the shivering earlier, the way she'd gone quiet in a specific way that wasn't calm. It was the quiet of someone managing something privately. He came and sat beside her. Not across from her this time. Beside her, close, their shoulders in contact. She leaned in slightly, didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. The warmth was practical. 2 people sharing a heat envelope is just physics. The surface area of loss reduces, the shared air between them warms and stays warmer. He knew that. She knew that. They sat in it without making it into something. The candle burned between them and a few feet forward. Outside, the wind surged again. Ran up the side of the cabin. The walls flexed once and then went still. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, he did drift. Not into real sleep. More like the body taking small recesses, 5 or 10 seconds at a time where the processing stopped and then came back. He was aware of this happening and let it because fighting it used energy he didn't have. Nora's breathing had slowed beside him. Even. Regular. He thought, without meaning to, about the drive up. 2 days ago. The argument they'd had about which road to take, which had seemed important at the time. He couldn't remember now what position he'd taken or why. He could remember the light, afternoon light on snow, that particular blue-white that doesn't exist anywhere except winter and late sun. He'd been watching the road and she'd been looking out the window at the tree line and they'd been arguing and the light had been that color. He didn't know why that came back to him now. He let it sit. At 4:40 a.m., the wind broke. Not ended, broke. The long sustained pressure shifted. The surges became shorter and farther apart. And in the spaces between them there was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of something gathering. The silence of something passing. Marcus had been watching the candle. It was down to less than an inch now. The flame was small. A blue base and a thin yellow tip, barely taller than a thumbnail. It was the end of the candle. He'd known for an hour it was coming. He'd watched it approach slowly and hadn't looked away, the way you watch the last of something. Nora was awake. She'd been awake for a while. He could tell by the quality of her stillness. "Wind's changing," she said quietly. "Yeah." The flame bent once, recovered, bent again. The wax was fully liquid now, pooling at the very bottom of the metal holder. He watched the wick shorten, watched the flame go narrow, and then it went out. The darkness was complete for about 4 seconds. Then his eyes adjusted and found the gap in the door. A thin, almost imperceptible thread of lighter gray where the outside existed. Not light, just the absence of pure black. Enough. He stood up slowly. His legs ached in a way that was deep and settled, the cold having worked into the joints over the last hours. He crossed the room and put his hand on the door. "I'm going to open it," he said. Nora stood beside him before he'd finished the sentence. He pulled the door open. The cold hit immediately, a full wall of it, -38 or near enough that the distinction didn't matter. His lungs contracted on the first breath, the moisture in the air crystallizing in his airways for a half-second before his body adjusted. He had to consciously keep himself from stepping back. Outside was white and dark and enormous. The storm had passed into something that wasn't calm but was no longer violent. The snow had settled. The sky to the east, he turned and looked, had the very first suggestion of gradient in it. Not light. Not yet. A shift in the shade of black toward something that might, in an hour, become dark blue. He stood in the doorway. Nora came up beside him and pulled her red scarf up over her nose, her eyes just visible above it, looking out at the same thing. He'd been watching her all night. The scarf had been a constant in his peripheral vision. Red against the dark green of her coat, red when she sat, red when her shoulders shook with cold, red when she'd gone quiet in that specific way. He'd used it without realizing, the color his eyes returned to when he needed to confirm she was still there, still upright, still herself. She was. The cold outside was extraordinary, unabstract. It had weight and texture, and it moved against exposed skin with an immediacy that made the last 7 hours feel comparative. But they were standing in it, and they were standing upright, and the door was open behind them. Marcus looked at the thermometer one more time before he stepped outside. -38. Same as it had been. He'd been in a room at -20 for 7 hours, and the world outside was still -38, and he was standing in it, breath in slow clouds, the eastern sky shifting from black to something darker than black, but not quite. He put one hand against the door frame. The wood was solid. Just wood. Nora stepped out beside him, and they stood in the open together for a few seconds. Just that, just standing, before he pulled the door closed behind them and they started moving slowly down the packed snow trail toward the trailhead, their footsteps the only sound in the enormous, quieting white. The candle was still on the floor inside. Burned down to nothing. He thought about it once, 50 yards down the trail. Didn't look back.